Film producer Tomoyuki Tanaka is flying back to Japan after negotiations in Jakarta. Toho Studios was preparing its new major film, Eiko no Kagi ni Shadow of Glory, a Japanese-Indonesian co-production that would center on a Japanese soldier stationed in the East Indies during Japan's occupation of Indonesia. Not even a decade after the end of the Second World War, anti-Japanese sentiment pressured the government to pull out of the production. Tanaka had personally gone to Jakarta in hopes to plead with the Indonesian government to commence with the film. The government was not swayed. The disheartened filmmaker mulled around ideas for a new film that the studio was desperate to release. Tanaka reflected on an American picture he had seen prior, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. A successful monster flick, while reviews were mediocre, the response to the special effects were in high praise. Tanaka was aware that there was an increase in popularity with nuclear-themed films. This was the duck and cover era, where anxieties were high over the thought of humanity's destruction at the hands of the new advancements in scientific weapons. This resulted in a multitude of nuclear-themed films, whether they be intense movies that explored humanity's hubris and its dangerous experimentations, the consequences of man's actions, as well as the cheesier flicks, most commonly the big monster scene. Many of these were just common insects or arachnids. Good or bad, these films were popular in the drive-in scene. Many of them poked fun at the real-world anxieties which helped alleviate concerns to viewers. Others felt more tension from the film's warnings. There were few films, however, that took such monstrous concept with ferocious caution, that being from a country that experienced the hell of nuclear consequence firsthand. In March of 1954, a tuna fishing boat named the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon No. 5, was out catching fish when tragedy struck. The boat was just sitting on the outside of a test zone for a hydrogen bomb. This was known as Castle Bravo, a series of United States thermonuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The test results went beyond expectations, and the weather conditions had moved the fallout to the Daigo Fukuryu. The fishermen noticed the fallout, but could not escape quickly enough due to the lengthy retrieval of their gear. Thus, the crew fell victim to exposure. One fisherman even tasted the fallout ash as he had thought it was snow. All 23 members of the boat were contaminated. The fishermen dubbed this radioactive dust as Shi no Hai, death ash. Within their return home, they immediately noticed signs of radiation poisoning. Their heads ached, their stomachs nauseated, and their vision distorted and their bowels irritated. The crew were able to bring the death ash back to be examined by the doctors, but this ash they held onto prolonged their exposure to the radiation. Professionals at Tokyo University confirmed the ash to be fallout from the H-bomb. The victims' conditions worsened to loss of hair, blisters on their face, burning, and bleeding, acute radiation syndrome. The US government refused any detailed information of the bomb as a national security measure. This was the Cold War era after all. Some officials even tried to shift the blame, stating that the effects on the fishermen were not caused by radiation, but rather by calcined coral. Some even tried to actually blame the Daigo as communist spies. Further investigation revealed that there were estimated around 100 other fishing boats that were all dancing around the edges of the danger zone. Victims of the blast. This could be the result of poor communications between nations, or just desperate measures of the fishermen in a poor economic state. As much as the US tried to downplay the event, the entire encounter inspired a rise in anti-nuclear movements. Japan in particular had already suffered so much that it was struggling to rebuild their country, trying to move forward in a better direction. But this event was nothing more than a reminder of the hellish experiences of war that now seemed inescapable. The incident would inspire countless media, most famously the opening sequence of Godzilla. Because of the growing popularity and anxieties, Tanaka also wanted to play with nuclear media. While on his flight back home, he wrote an outline for his own monster film, The Giant Monster from 20,000 Miles Beneath the Sea. Well, by this point everyone is aware that Godzilla is one of the most famous and successful ripoffs of all time. Once he arrived back to Japan, he went straight to film producers at Toho to get the film greenlit. The film was approved and went to special effects artist Eiji Tsuburaya, the man responsible for the visual spectacles in all of your favorite kaiju classics. Tsuburaya had already written a script for a film about a ship being attacked by a giant octopus many years prior that he attributed to the writing of Godzilla. Originally, Shinkichi Taniguchi was asked to direct, known for his controversial film Escape at Dawn. He declined working on Godzilla though, as did many Toho directors who were more interested in working on war-related films or jidaigekis to incorporate modern social concerns or issues into. Like many critics, those filmmakers struggled to see how much of that was already in Godzilla. It was Tanaka's decision to hire filmmaker Ishiro Honda to direct the now named Project Giant, or Project G for short. Ishiro Honda is one of the most important Japanese filmmakers, up there with Akira Kurosawa, who was a good friend and colleague to Honda, Mizoguchi, and Ozu, although many film textbooks neglect to mention his name. He is the co-creator of the kaiju genre and was the most successful Japanese filmmaker internationally before Miyazaki. Honda grew up in a religious household, his father and grandfather both being Buddhist monks. But unlike his siblings, Honda had always had an attraction to science. His scientific curiosity would lead to his interest in directing Godzilla. He studied filmmaking at university in the 1930s, but his class was incredibly small and unorganized. Most classes were cancelled, which resulted in Honda going to a theater to watch films during that time slot. Honda was set to work as an assistant director on a film in 1934 until he received his notice, a draft notice for the Imperial Army of Japan. Honda was 23 when he joined the military and was called into action in January of 1935. Unfortunately, Honda was under the command of a tyrannical officer, one that even the government saw as an unhinged threat. The resulting investigation reprimanded the officer and his men, including Honda, who had continually been called to war well after completing his service time. Honda spent some time as a POW to the Chinese Revolutionary Army near the end of the war. He described this time as rather peaceful and made friends with some monks. Honda served 3 tours and would experience sporadic nightmares of the war for the remainder of his life. And at the end of the war, he witnessed the aftermath of Hiroshima.
絶対にここには臭いとが入らないということを言われたでしょ。そういうものがやっぱりね、気持ちの中にあるんですよね。そうしてくるとその原爆というものに関する憎しみみたいなものっていうか、これもの作ってこんなものを次から次へだったらえれいことじゃないかというそういう気持ちがいわゆるね演出家としてね、ゴジラにを動かすのに。
Honda's history in the war was another factor of interest for Toho in hiring him to direct Godzilla. During the war, Toho was forced by the government to produce war propaganda films as the Nazis had done in Germany. Once the war was over, the new government during occupation encouraged the concept of unions. This led to strikes in the studio, which ultimately removed many seasoned filmmakers and stars, and brought in many newcomers, soon-to-be legends such as Toshiro Mifune and Akira Kurosawa included. Honda almost immediately went back to working on films, mostly as an assistant director. One of those works included Kurosawa's famous noir hit, Stray Dog. Honda would direct his first feature film in 1951. He was reluctant to work with war films, now a popular genre, and understandably so, which helped attract him to the idea of a giant monster film, something completely different and new. A film that would explore all of his scientific curiosities as well as contemporary issues. All of these factors combined made him the only director in Toho who took the concept seriously. Honda had much experience with documentary filmmaking, and was acutely aware that film critics had a disdain for the science fiction genre at this time. And so he set out to make a giant monster movie without any camp, but rather one that does take itself seriously. The original script was written by Shigeru Kageyama, whose concept was near identical to the Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, as well as other generic monster tropes. Godzilla would be less destructive and more animalistic, with a King Kong-style attraction to women. Yamane also would have worn a cape and been a more westernized character. The film would end on a propaganda note using real footage of H-bombs the victims of the Daigo Fukuryumaru. Honda and screenwriter Takao Murata locked themselves in an inn for 3 weeks trying to take Kageyama's script and turn it into a functioning screenplay. Tsuburaya and Tanaka also pitched in to help. Godzilla's original name, Gojira, originated from his early designs. Gojira is the combination of gorilla and kujira, whale. At the time of development, the movie was still using the working title Project G, whereas Gojira's name came from a contest amongst the crew. There was a famous story going around that the name came from a Toho employee nicknamed Gojira, but Honda's wife has debunked this story. It seemed that it took a while before the team settled on the dinosaur appearance. Some of the early designs include the now infamous mushroom-shaped head. The development team based its design on combining a T-Rex with an iguanodon wearing dorsal fins from a Stegosaurus. Once the design was settled, the next part was to go about bringing the creature to screen. Stop motion was Tsuburaya's first idea, as King Kong had recently been re-released in theaters and fared far more successfully than its initial release. It goes without saying how inspirational that film was to special effect artists. But unfortunately, the resources didn't pan out, and thus the core Godzilla effects were done with suitmation. The original suit weighed 220 pounds. Suit actor Haru Nakajima collapsed the first time wearing the suit, resorting to it being chopped up and used for partial shots. The team made a second, lighter suit, and Nakajima could only wear it for a few minutes before collapsing. A second actor also wore the suit for the film, Katsumi Tsuka. When it finally came to filming, Honda wanted to check the determination of the crew. He had the entire crew read the script and asked anyone who was not committed to it to leave. Although most of the film was shot in Toho Studios lots, there was some on-location shooting, mostly for the Odo Island scenes, shot in Shima Peninsula. Many locals were used as extras, including the famous dance ritual scene. The working conditions were brutal. Honda received permanent scarring from sun damage due to the excessive heat. It took 51 days of shooting for the film. Careful planning and consideration were taken into account for the special effects team. In order to properly mesh the monster effects with the live-action actors, meant Tsuburaya had to speak with Honda every morning before shooting to have a good idea of the scene's compositions to properly structure the creature scenes. Honda and Tsuburaya often argued on certain stitching of scenes. Tsuburaya and his team would scout locations to plan out the film, and were actually arrested by the police who overheard them plotting destruction. The special effects took 71 days to shoot. When we watch Godzilla, we think of him being a metaphor for the atomic bomb. Although truthfully, this film was a more direct response to the ongoing nuclear testing of the time. The opening is a near recreation of the Daigo Fukuryumaru incident. A fishing boat just minding its own business finds itself victim to Godzilla's atomic heat. You can actually see the life preserver here has the character for 5 written on it in respect to those fishermen. Following the destruction, the film spends a great deal recreating the hysteria that followed. Many Japanese citizens, especially those connected to the fishermen, are scared, angry, and confused by the entire situation. As the film illustrates throughout, we can see the Japanese people are trying to move forward from the recent war, but now this event has shaken up the already emotionally scarred people. What's worse is that the authorities are just as confused and have little understanding of what happened. The few survivors of the ship describe the event similarly to that of the H-bomb. When the Daigo incident happened, the tuna industry fell apart as citizens were scared to eat the fish due to the possible radiation poisoning. Godzilla also tackles this. The fish have all disappeared, leading to a downslope for fishermen, or the fishing industry. Something is interfering with the natural order, and now a major source of food and income has become scarce. An investigation is opened, leading the officials to Odo Island. The villagers have a real sense of authenticity to them, and that's because many of them were locals and not actors. Odo Island is interesting as it shows a more traditional side of Japan during this era of occupation and reconstruction. Much like the Meiji era, Japan was going through multiple reforms, but Odo Island is essentially cut off from that. It also explores the generational gaps with more traditional elders versus the youngers who share a more modern thought and philosophies. This is a common trope you'll see in many Japanese post-war cinema that studies this generational gap. There's also similarities to be said about Skull Island from King Kong, but truthfully that belongs more with Infant Island and Mothra. The traditional people of Odo Island bring in superstitions. To them, Godzilla is a deity, opposed to the scientific approach held by the cast of leads. In the atomic age of cinema, they almost always shoved the bomb down your throat to enforce that that was the cause for everything. Like the original script of Godzilla was going to open in a generic fashion. Godzilla skips the science of the creature and goes straight into action. Godzilla is already awake. He is attacked without warning. The film does state that he was most likely awakened by nuclear testing, but it's all theoretical to the story. It adds this extra layer of menace and power to the strange creature as its origin is unconfirmed, at least in this isolated film. Honda introduces a reporter role to provide extra intelligence of the supernatural beliefs of Odo Island. Although the reporter is a minute role in the original, it ends up overtaking most of the film with Raymond Burr in the US recut. Even still, there's something that feels westernized in this approach. As you'll notice looking at post-war cinema, you'll see how Japanese films really incorporated a lot of influence from Western filmmaking. The famous Odo ritual dance was performed by real villagers. The music was put in later by film composer Akira Ifukube. Given the complex production of the picture, Ifukube wasn't able to see the film when composing for it. He took the job because he was excited to create music for a rampaging monster, but ultimately remarked that he was very confused during the film's production, and so he merely focused on creating something that sounded enormous. Godzilla's next appearance is during a powerful typhoon. The original script had us set to see the king here, but Honda and the others thought it would be more interesting to hold on his reveal. His presence is very much known to us though. Unfortunately, the one person who does see him is killed, which adds this extra layer of danger to Godzilla, a beast who cannot even be witnessed without paying with your life. And to add an extra layer of tragedy, this man was the last survivor of one of Godzilla's attacks on a boat. Much like the victims of the Daigo, one of which died well after the initial event happened due to his prolonged illness from radiation. Not to mention, he also makes his appearance during a typhoon, which gives this stellar entrance and also this divine sense to the monster. This is our first major showcase in Eiji Tsuburai's specialty. Even before he was making monstrous destructions, he made a name for himself in this spectacular war effects. Many of the effects handled in this film simply just weren't a practice in Japan yet. There weren't people trained in it, and there weren't jobs for it in film yet. Tsuburaya truly was a pioneer in the special effects department for Japan. He could so vividly imagine what we should be seeing on the film and could actually actualize it in a way that no other in Japan could. We should feel so lucky that it was him who was put onto this film, or else it might have been something merely forgotten to history. Following Odo, we see a sequence where witnesses for the event demand the government for assistance and for disaster relief. One of the people speaking is a young boy that had been orphaned by Godzilla. This most likely was a call to attention to the orphans created during the war and those families afflicted. We can also sense the overall population's attitude of desire for relief post-war. Given how torn apart the country was, it was a long and grueling process, not just to rebuild their government, but to rebuild their world. Many soldiers found that they had no home to return to, and their families were missing, or worse. We can sense fragments of those feelings of loss bleeding through here. One of the chief human characters, Yamane, is introduced, who is a very central character to the story's message. Yamane is played by Takashi Shimura, who is a very famous face of Japanese cinema, from Kurosawa's Seven Samurai to the terminally ill man looking for a meaning in life in Ikiru. Shimura was already established as an actor who played roles of characters we could look up to in Japanese films, and for audiences, it was a character easy to latch onto. In this film, he's a scientist who states that we must study Godzilla and heed the warnings that he brings. But he also brings in this moral dilemma of, do we destroy Godzilla or do we study him? The government thinks that if they can somehow kill Godzilla, that's the only way to live in peace, which opens a whole can of worms discussion on the best way to go about handling Godzilla. The film's love triangle was another addition by Honda, one that added extra life to the human story. Many modern Godzilla fans have begged for a monster film without any human characters, but it's not the humans that are the issue, it's the poorly written ones. Whereas, even the campier films later on still do a better job at making likable characters, we want to stick with and watch their journey. Emiko and Ogata are essentially the film's lead roles, although the movie really isn't structured to be carried out with leads the same you would see in, say, a Hollywood picture, where we follow two potential lovers and whatever scientific or atomic shenanigans for the whole movie. Godzilla is told in a much wider scope and offers us multiple perspectives. Nonetheless, we find ourselves attracted to Emiko's love triangle, which brings in Zarasawa. Although he wears an eye patch and is a scientist, he's no James Bond villain. The eye patch is merely his permanent reminder of the war. Although it may seem trivial now, as this film unfolds, we'll see just how important they are to the story and its entirety. The film already is creating symbolic connections, such as the ship they ride is in the constant potential danger of being attacked by Godzilla without any warning. You could say the same about the affair held between Ogata and Emiko. Their relationship was also adding on to these westernization and modernization against traditional themes. We can consider how Sarasawa and Emiko's marriage was most likely set up and approved by her father Yamane, and she is far too scared of the conflict that would ensue with asking to break it off to be with Ogata. Ogata is played by Akira Takarada, who has starred in many Godzilla films. He was a young and unknown actor at the time, and even showed up on the first day of set, being an excited youth, with his first lead role, introducing himself as the star of the film, in which someone responded with, "You aren't the star. Godzilla is." Takarada did not struggle to have a successful career post-Godzilla, and had a very prominent face in Japanese cinema. He was immensely proud of his work in the series. He spent a lot of time coming to America for G-Fest and meeting international fans. The leading lady, on the other hand, played by Momoko Kochi, had a different feeling on the film. For years, she despised the film and how people perceived her after it. It wasn't until 1995, when she made the return to her character of Emiko in Godzilla vs. Destroya, that she rewatched the film and felt a greater appreciation for it. When studying the location of Godzilla's attack, notice how the scientist points out that there is radiation on the site. In a Hollywood flick, we would probably have mass hysteria, coated in hazmat suits and whatnot. Here, no one even flinches. There's a cool-headed nature to this, to look at things analytically. The Odo Island sequence also uses this interesting optical effect to give this illusion of Godzilla's footprints. These are paintings done on acrylic glass to achieve this sort of masking over the real photography. We finally get our first look at Godzilla, and it's a hand puppet. This puppet, while not matching the quality of the rubber suit, does still bear a close appearance. The puppet is used for many close-up shots, and we'll see it more throughout the film. Notice how the people are actually running towards Godzilla instead of away. In most monster movies, in most Godzilla movies, you'd see the famous image of people running away from the monster, but here, everybody wants to get the first look at the king and give him a little photo op, which conveniently is turned into this superior matte painting. Yamane brings the findings to the government and explains his theory. The atomic bombings have awakened this prehistoric creature that was dormant for centuries. A lot of American censors felt that this was anti-American sentiment, although the film never once directly blames the US, nor is Honda blaming the US. Still, many Americans felt attacked by the film's claims. The film also has its own argument about whether or not blame should be made, or if the information should even go public, and the only one who really speaks out for the betterment of the people is a female senator. You don't really see women with such a powerful stance in these films of this era. There is a layer of misogyny that exists here and that Honda is calling attention to. Even the more obvious is the political conflict here. We can see how the government fails to handle the Godzilla situation, which is more relevant to the wavering faith many held for bureaucracy during this time period. Calling out greedy capitalism and its influence is not something Honda has shied away from in his career. One of the best scenes in the film shows a group of Japanese citizens discussing the events from what little information they have. Their understanding is limited to what they see in the paper and only have comparisons to make to the recent atomic bombings and air raid shelters. The scene was ultimately removed in the Raymond Burr version, and probably because they didn't want to spur anything with American audiences with such detailed reminiscence of the Japanese POV from the war. Yamane's house is rather wealthy comparatively to the modern Japanese citizen at this point. They even have a TV. A few years after this, Ozu would make Good Morning, a light-hearted movie about two children who spend a lot of time trying to convince their parents to go get a TV for their household. Again, this was a film post-Godzilla, which, while its focus is on generational and parental themes, we can think about how uncommon it was for households to have a nice TV like this at the time. But even then, the orphan boy from Odo Island that they adopted is a reminder of the previous horrors. A brief moment of relief immediately interrupted as Godzilla makes his appearance to a ship of civilians trying to have a good time, much like Japan's own peace was interrupted by constant nuclear testing, which tells the government that their plan to kill Godzilla has failed and instills more confusion and anxiety to them. And there's Nakajima, Godzilla's suit actor, and there's Tezuka, the other suit actor. Dr. Sarasawa is played by Akihiko Hirata, another prolific face in Japanese cinema. His role is akin to that of Oppenheimer, a scientist who develops a deadly weapon and feels immediate guilt or fear for its consequences. Sarasawa is presented a bit eccentrically. Although he creates this great weapon, he does not act like a mad scientist, although his environment would lead you to believe otherwise. It's almost like a fake-out, to have us suspect him villainous when there is nothing really villainous about him. Some have speculated that Sarasawa was actually a Nazi collaborator, which I find very difficult to believe. Hirata's performance gives us all we need to know. This is a man of conscience, a brilliant scientist, but burdened by the guilt of his creation. He shows it to Emiko, the first person he's presented it to, because as they are to be married, it's the person he evidently trusts the most. Emiko's horrified reaction is all the backing he needs to settle within himself that this creation is far too dangerous to be known to the public. Nearly an hour in and we get the first major full-scale attack by Godzilla. The trope of him rising from the water, which as you could imagine was incredibly difficult given how heavy the suit was. Tsuburaya had men pulling up the actor from the water off screen. Godzilla's attack happens at night, which meshes so elegantly with the film's black and white. It helps to amplify the gritty presence and the overall mood. We also have our first trope from this genre, the running crowds. I would say that this film's serious tone adds more weight to this, but if you look closely, you can actually see that most of these extras don't care, or just find the situation amusing. The famous scene of Godzilla stepping on the train was one of the most complex. They had only one shot to get this take because of the miniatures of the trains that were destroyed. Everything had to be timed out with Godzilla's foot coming down, the explosions from the production team, and the train's placement. The cameraman on the scene was so scared of messing up he thought he would lose his job. Instead, we got one of the most famous scenes in horror history. The first rampage forces the assistance of the international military, who we don't really see much of in this picture. The military comes up with a plan to build essentially a major electrical fence, a nearly 100-foot tall perimeter, that they just so happen to build precisely where Godzilla is to reemerge. The film doesn't really explain how they figured out his tracking, but I suppose they were more concerned with the pacing at this point of the movie. The city is evacuated by some rather cheerful military officers. This imagery must have been eerily reminiscent of the constant evacuations during air raids. There's some documentary elements here with the military caravans. These shots were of actual military transportations from different bases that Honda and his crew captured. It's actually an impressive time capsule when looking back on it now. If you look closely to the camera shakes, you can actually see the masking here of the electrical towers that were matte paintings added in during post. The more still shots obviously blended better than the shakier ones. As the disgruntled Yamane returns home, Ogata for some reason thinks that this is the best time to ask for Emiko's hand in marriage. Given all the weight that's on Yamane right now, let alone the entire country of Japan, this somehow was Ogata's best idea of a time to propose this. The discussion shifts to Godzilla, however, and it becomes reflective of political divide as well. We have two parties here of different beliefs on how to handle the situation. Yamane, who wants to study Godzilla, versus Ogata, who is more considerate of the people, and they both have good points. And then Godzilla's back, and this is the most famous sequence, a true visual splendor of heartbreaking destruction. The film builds up intensity in its pacing of Godzilla's march towards the fence. We see the hopeful and fearful expressions of those hoping this plan will work. As Godzilla approaches, Ashiro Honda himself pulls the switch and hopes to fry the beast, but to no avail. The miniature towers were made using wax, so that they would melt easier when Godzilla demonstrates his atomic breath. This effect is created by using a little hose with the puppet Godzilla which shot out water mist. Atomic breath gives us haunted images of civilians being burned to death, again reminiscent of the atomic blast or even the victims of the Daigo Fukuryu. You may notice that while these are the most visually exciting aspects of the film, the quality seems a little bit lower than the rest of the movie. That's not super uncommon to see dust or scratch marks on these older films, but in particular with these matte masks and cross-editing with the visual effects scenes, you can see that the editing room conditions might not have been super ideal given how worn the film looks in these scenes. It does give a more documentary feel to these moments though, as if we were watching footage from an old news broadcast. This attack sequence is actually happening in Ginza, which is revisited in Godzilla Minus One. Ginza is a popular shopping district. It was originally seen as a location of modernization, following its destruction and reconstruction in the Meiji Restoration of Japan. Since then, it's been a very popular westernized shopping district of Tokyo. Tsuburaya's team went through painstaking effort to recreate Ginza as it would have looked back in 1954 in miniatures for Godzilla's Rampage. Miniatures aside, multiple optical effects here are used to trick your senses into seeing Godzilla in the real world both by utilizing appropriate timing and masking, such as little details as putting people into these buildings that he's looking over. When we see Godzilla, we get a grin on our face as he rampages and causes destruction as he's fighting other monsters. In this film, however, it carries such a weight in its destruction that we watch in horror, watching a country only just rebuild itself to be torn back down again by a neutral force that has been interrupted by humanity's hubris. A scene that really drives this home, and perhaps the most haunting moment in the entire franchise, is this moment here. A mother holds her two children, fully aware that they are about to die. There is no escape, there is no hope. All she can do now is try to alleviate their fear by promising they'll be reunited with their father soon. We can't help but imagine how many times a scene like this played during the war. Not just from Japan's perspective, but something that ought to be relatable to many victims of war internationally. Immediately after Godzilla destroys the Hattori clock, one of the most iconic landmarks of Tokyo standing above the Wako department store, the building there in which Godzilla's tail goes into is actually one of the most popular theaters in Japan in the time in which this film premiered. It must have been frightening to be sitting in those theater seats and watching his tail go through the screen. Godzilla then proceeds to destroy the National Diet Building, which just goes to show how insignificant the government is against his power. Like a typhoon or an earthquake. As Godzilla heads back to the water, Japanese aviators lead a fruitless counterattack that yet again shows how minuscule their weaponry is against this force. The aftermath of Godzilla's attack reminds us of the atomic bombings and destructions left after the war. The fires still haven't even extinguished. Moments like these, yet again, further the weight of Godzilla's attack, the mother dying, leaving her crying child all alone in the world. All these injured victims. It's a sight we don't really see much in films of this time, and it must have been striking the Japanese audiences. It was enough for Emiko to break her promise and reveal the oxygen destroyer to Ogata, who presses Sarasawa to use it against Godzilla. It's actually interesting here from an actor's perspective. We can see Harada does something clever here, where he seems to be preparing himself for Ogata and Emiko to reveal their love for one another, but instead is completely taken aback when Ogata directly mentions the oxygen destroyer. This guy just can't catch a break. It's interesting how Honda chose to not show the only moment of actual physical human-on-human conflict. Sarasawa is a more conscious man of science and believes that only tragedy will follow suit if his horrific device is created. But he is also moved by the destruction of Japan, and he feels his pride as a Japanese citizen to try and do whatever he can to help, under the condition that his weapon is never used again. It is only because of how dire the situation is. We can't help but feel that Honda and the screenwriters are trying to implore the scientists of the Cold War era to consider these thoughts. Honda does not attack men of science who create weapons or makes these breakthroughs, but rather questions the ethical side of it. He has shown his wavering faith in the politics and in the military. All that's left is science. But even then, what to do with these breakthroughs? You can see that not only has Sarasawa been swayed, but so has Yamane. The final sequence actually shows us Godzilla underwater. Not a very common sight in the franchise, and it's just immensely impressive how these underwater sequences were captured. This film's release was the same year as Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is a film you might think of as an early case of really splendid underwater sequences. The film sequence is incredibly somber, using the same music motifs from the aftermath of his destruction, opposed to the military march. We have this sense of dread that something awful most likely will happen. We, as an audience, probably suspect Sarasawa's sacrifice, but even still, seeing a protagonist commit suicide on screen wasn't super common. Usually, they'd squeeze out through some absurd means. Sarasawa's sacrifice is cumulative of the film's themes, and solidifies him as the coolest human character in the franchise. Well, besides for Don Fry. When the film ends, there's very little cheering, and Yamane states that if we don't watch our steps, another Godzilla may arrive. Oh boy, it did. It's been 70 years since Godzilla's release, and it has, to this day, been the largest franchise in cinema history. Although it wasn't as highly respected on its first release. Critics were rather mixed on it, and it didn't help that the American cut removed much of the original themes and somewhat reduced it to another B-movie, although that version is still very interesting, making it difficult for those audiences to fully grasp what was so important about this film. As Tomoyuki Tanaka himself said, the theme of the film was the terror of the bomb. Mankind had created the bomb, and now nature was going to take its revenge on mankind. Godzilla was, in truth, one of the most important pieces of anti-nuclear protest. With all the rising tensions and this invisible fear holding a chokehold on Japan, it played intensely with those anxieties. But even then, Godzilla is not just a force of malice. Many have seen the creature just as much of a victim to humanity's hubris. Godzilla has been seen through many reforms over the years, from the less intense monster to a goofy, happy dancing superhero. And that's probably what's most appealing of the franchise, the fact that there's something to offer everyone. Some will argue that it's lost its original meaning. To a degree, that's true, but don't forget that many of those who worked on the original also made a lot of those Showa films too, and while we remember them as cheesy movies, many still held important themes and messages that Honda wanted to convey to the audience, and most importantly, the younger ones, in hopes that they'll grow up remembering what these movies were trying to teach them. While we love all these aspects, it's undeniable how important the original Godzilla is. It's not a cheap monster flick that blends in with the atomic era. It is a masterpiece, and newer entries like Minus One show that audiences are still interested in seeing a more thematic presentation of the King of the Monsters.